Hi students, in this video we're going to take a look at how to reconstruct arguments. So in previous videos we've learned about evaluating arguments, but now we're going to think about, well, how do we take arguments that other people have already given us and put them into standard form so that they're valid. I've got a picture of an argument here. Someone says, why don't you want to wear a party hat when everyone else is wearing a party hat? Now, it might not seem like that's an argument, it seems like a question or something like that. But the implication here is that you should be wearing a party hat, and so we want to figure out, in order to figure out maybe like why that's a bad argument, we need to figure out, well, what's the argument that this person is making? And we can, if we're explicit about that here, or we know how to do that, then we can do that in a lot of different cases. So that's the skill we're going to be learning. I've sort of said this already. Now that we know the difference between valid and invalid arguments, we can use it to construct and reconstruct arguments. When I'm talking about constructing an argument, that means putting the premises and conclusion of your own argument into standard form. So constructing is like, I'm going to make an argument. Reconstructing an argument involves sort of taking what someone else has given and putting that argument into standard form. So the thought here is like, I'm not just making something up of my own, rather I'm taking what other people have said and I'm modifying it so that I can put it into this standard form. In both cases, we're highlighting someone's reasons for believing some conclusion. So we're sort of laying out, here's why I think X, or here's why someone else thinks X. So here's an argument we'll be looking at. The argument goes like this. Smoking will make you look cool. If smoking will make you look cool, then you should do it. Therefore, you should smoke. Now, if we want to reconstruct an argument, the first thing we need to do is to find an argument. And we've got one here. So, arguments are everywhere. They're maybe not everywhere, right? But they're all over the place. They're pretty common, but they're rarely put as explicitly as some of these arguments will be. I think the easiest way to learn how to reconstruct an argument is to take some pretty obvious examples, but the goal in time would be that you can sort of see the kinds of arguments that other people are making, or you can get a sense like, hey, this person's making an argument, and you can reconstruct it. So finding an argument, I've got an argument here. Step number 2, identify that argument's conclusion. So what's this person trying to get me to believe? In this case, right, we want to ask ourselves, what's the author trying to get me to believe? What is it here? It's that you should smoke. It comes after the word therefore. Therefore is going to be a conclusion indicator word. So whenever you see this word therefore, you might suspect that what comes after it is the conclusion. Step number 3, we want to identify the argument's premises. To do this, we want to ask ourselves, which of the remaining claims, the other things that this person is saying, provide support for the conclusion? So in this one, we've got 2 other sentences, and both of those actually support the conclusion. So the first one, smoking will make you look cool. That's a reason that the author is giving for this conclusion that we should smoke. The other sentences as well. So if smoking will make you look cool, then you should do it. So that's another reason the person's giving. Again, here the idea is like, if there's something that makes you look cool, you should do it. It makes you look cool. So those 2 things are working together. So the second premise is, if smoking will make you look cool, then you should do it. Now, some people will say, like, John, I don't think this is a very good argument because smoking doesn't make you look cool. But sure, it does. Look at that guy. He looks pretty cool. Or this woman, right? Looks pretty cool. And if in case you needed any more convincing, right? We also have this guy right here. Right? On the left, nerd. On the right, just add some sunglasses, a cigarette, sick mofo. That's what you get. So, anyway, in case you didn't find that argument persuasive to begin with. Now, hopefully, you find it more persuasive. But maybe more importantly, hopefully, you've gotten a good laugh out of this. Okay. So we've got our conclusion, we got the premises. Now, at this point, we want to put the argument into standard form. So what that involves is listing the argument's premises above its conclusion and labeling those things. So we've got the conclusion down here, you should smoke. We've got premise 1, smoking will make you look cool. We've got premise 2, if smoking will make you look cool, then you should do it. And there's our argument. It's in standard form or premise conclusion form. Now the final step is to determine whether the argument is valid. To do this, we want to symbolize the argument and check whether it takes a valid form. So here I put C for premise 1. So I put C there. Smoking will make you look cool. Again, that's not an if-then claim, it's just a claim about smoking. So we're just going to give that letter C. If smoking will make you look cool, if C, then you should do it. You should smoke. So I'm going to say, if C, then S. You should do it, where it is smoking, so you should smoke. And that's what we have here in the conclusion, S again. So we've symbolized the argument that we have and checking, does that argument take valid form? Now if you've learned your valid argument forms, which hopefully you're doing or you're getting close to, if you haven't done it right, take a look at the sheet that has the valid argument forms on it and say, is this one? And the answer is yes. This argument takes the form modus ponens, so it's valid and we don't have to do anything else to the argument. We've reconstructed an argument, we've taken what the reasons somebody was giving, we put them in this right order, now we've got their argument. And now we can evaluate it, right? So, smoking will make you look cool. I've already given you good evidence. That's true. Maybe you accepted the evidence or not. But we might also say, well, let's say we grant premise 1. Maybe just because smoking will make you look cool doesn't mean you should do it. And that's because there are a lot of things that make you look cool that you shouldn't do. And we could come up with some examples of those. Let's try another one. You shouldn't smoke because if smoking were something you should do, then it wouldn't annoy others, but it does annoy others. Alright, this is a little bit more complex. Step 1, where's the argument? Boom, right there. Step 2, what's the conclusion? You shouldn't smoke is the conclusion. One sort of tip for helping us find this, the word because, right? Because is a premise indicator word. What comes after because is ordinarily a premise. Now, when I say what comes after because is a premise, it's also true that what comes before the word because is often a conclusion. So because sort of indicates that a premise is coming, but it's also sort of indicating that a conclusion came before. So that's what our conclusion is. Identify the argument's premises. So what comes after because is a premise. If smoking were something you should do, then it wouldn't annoy others. And then we've got another premise down here. Smoking does annoy others. So this comma, but, is an indication that here's just some other claim that's separate. Figuring out exactly where to break up these sentences or statements, propositions, not propositions, propositions, sorry. It's kind of tricky, but it should be relatively simple. I'm going to try and make it relatively straightforward for you. Okay. So that's what we did. If smoking were something you should do, then it wouldn't annoy others. But smoking does annoy others. And I get it from it does annoy others. What's it? Smoking. Okay. So we've gotten all the pieces. We just need to put them into standard form. We've done that. Step 5, is this argument valid? Well, now I need to symbolize. So if smoking were something you should do, excuse me, I've symbolized that as S. If smoking were something you should do, then it wouldn't annoy others. Then it would not be tilde A. It wouldn't be annoying. But smoking is annoying. A. Therefore, not S. Smoking isn't something you should do. You shouldn't do it. That's the negation of S. All right, is this argument valid? This one's a little bit trickier, but if you know your forms, right, you should be able to pick up on it. It's not modus ponens. Modus ponens would be S arrow, not A, S, therefore not A. But here we get A as the second premise. Now what's that? That's really equivalent to not A. And not A is the negation of not A. So A is also the negation of not A. We're essentially denying the consequent, which is valid. Not denying the antecedent, that's the invalid one. Denying the consequent is good. So this argument takes the form modus tollens, essentially A, therefore B, but not B, therefore not A. So it's valid, and we're done. In both of these examples, all the arguments' premises were explicit. That is, all the arguments' premises appeared in the original text. But that won't always be the case. Sometimes we'll need to provide an implicit premise to make an argument valid. So we're going to look at some examples of that. Here's an argument. A lot of smoking examples here. The argument is you should smoke, it makes you feel good. We want to find the argument. There it is. Identify the conclusion. What's the conclusion? Is it that we should smoke? Is it that smoking makes us feel good? Is it something else entirely? Obviously, it's that we should smoke. That's the conclusion. What are the argument's premises? Well, there's just one. Smoking makes you feel good. So that's our premise. Step 4 says, put this in standard form. You should smoke. That's the conclusion. Smoking makes you feel good. That's the premise. But now, no argument can be valid unless it's got multiple premises. There's no inference going on. So we need more than just this single premise. Smoking makes you feel good. We can't know anything beyond that without some other information. So we need premise 2. What is it going to be? Okay, so we've got this argument in standard form. Determine whether the argument's valid. So we can't, I guess the answer is the argument's not valid as it is. So we have A as a premise and B as a conclusion. That's not valid. But what we can see is that we need to make this argument valid, and to make it valid, we can supply some missing premise that when combined with A, validly gets us to B. So what premise would that be? If you look at your valid forms, you might know, well, if I've got a simple statement and I need to get another simple statement, I can just have a conditional, a premise that says if A, if the premise, then B, then the conclusion. So I'm going to fill that in. If smoking makes you feel good, if A, then you should do it. You should smoke. Or B. And this argument, now that I've filled it in with a missing premise, we've got a valid argument here. Now, what this is valuable for, right, again, is so that we can look at, is this a good argument? Should we be convinced? If someone told you should smoke, it makes you feel good, you might be like, oh yeah, smoking, it does make me feel good. And so that sounds like a pretty good reason for me to smoke. I can't think why it wouldn't work. Okay, that's maybe simple, you might see through that, but to see why this argument's bad, why you shouldn't be convinced by it, we would highlight this premise and say, if smoking makes you feel good, then you should do it. And we could say, that premise is false. This argument that I should smoke depends not just on the claim that smoking makes me feel good, it also depends on this claim that if something makes me feel good, then I should do it. But that claim is obviously false. There are a lot of things that might make me feel good, like punching my brother or something like that, but that I shouldn't do. And so just because smoking makes me feel good doesn't mean that I can conclude that I should smoke. All right. So this argument's valid. I'm done. I can evaluate it like I just did, or analyze the truth of the premises. All right, one more. How would we reconstruct this argument? So if smoking is unhealthy, then you shouldn't do it. So you shouldn't smoke. Step 1, what's the conclusion? You shouldn't smoke. Step 2, what's the premise? If smoking is unhealthy, you shouldn't do it. That's the premise. What's the missing premise? Well, to do that, we should symbolize what we've got. The first premise, if smoking is unhealthy, then you shouldn't do it. That's B. Conclusion, you shouldn't smoke. That's B. So what are we missing? We're missing the claim that smoking is unhealthy. That's the thing we need in order to get from A arrow B to B. So, as I say at the bottom here, we need to supply a premise that when combined with A arrow B gets us B. That premise is A. What is A? It's just the claim that smoking is unhealthy. So we add that in. Now we've got a valid argument. And again, we can evaluate this. If smoking is unhealthy, then you shouldn't do it. Smoking is unhealthy, therefore you shouldn't smoke. If we look at the premises, we may say, well, are these valid or not? Sorry, are they true or not? Validity is a property of arguments, not a property of premises. Are the premises true? Well, it does seem like smoking is unhealthy. That sounds right. If smoking is unhealthy, then you shouldn't do it. Well, are there some unhealthy things you should do? Maybe. Yeah, there are. So maybe this isn't going to be a perfect argument, but we could maybe modify it and strengthen it a bit. Certainly, most of us probably think that this argument's like basically on the right track. That smoking is unhealthy is a pretty good reason not to do it. Okay, so to summarize, first step, find the argument. Second, identify the argument's conclusion. Third step, identify the argument's premises. Fourth step, put the argument in standard form, leaving room for any implicit premises that might be there. 5, determine whether the argument's valid. If the argument is valid at that point, you're done. If it's not, then you'll need to either add an implicit premise or implicit conclusion. We've shown you sort of how to do that. Or if the argument, as you've reconstructed it, is not valid, then you've done something wrong. You've put a premise in the wrong place. When we reconstruct someone else's argument, we're always going to try and put it in a valid form, right? Otherwise, we know it's a bad argument. Sometimes people do make bad arguments, but we're always going to be trying to put those arguments into a valid form, the best one that we can come up with, so that we can really take on their ideas in the best form that they're coming in. So having done all this, and now that we've got some, practice under our belt, let's return to that original argument. This person says, why don't you want to wear a party hat when everyone else is wearing one? And I put a period here following the sentence that they give, but I'm thinking now maybe a question mark is a better ending to this. Now, how would we reconstruct this? One thing worth noting, right, is that we want to start by figuring out what the conclusion is. What's the conclusion? I don't think it's there. I don't think when they've said this thing, they've given us the conclusion. But it does imply a certain kind of conclusion. The implied conclusion is that you should wear a party hat, right? What's our evidence? Well, it's that everyone else is wearing one, that you should want to wear one, or you should be wearing one. So sometimes the conclusion can be implicit, and that's what happens here. So you should wear a party hat. That's the conclusion. What's the premise? Well, it's that everyone else is wearing one. everyone else is wearing a party hat, so that's our premise. Now we might say, well, how do we symbolize what we have? Everyone else is wearing a party hat, that's A. You should wear a party hat, that's B. What's the missing premise? Well, it's going to be a premise that when combined with A gets us B. What would that be? A arrow B. That's the premise that we're missing. That's the premise we need to make a valid argument with the form modus ponens. So let's fill that in. If A, everyone else is wearing a party hat, then B, you should do it too. You should wear a party hat. That's B. So now we've reconstructed the argument. It's valid, takes the form modus ponens, and we can evaluate it. Everyone else is wearing a party hat? Yep, definitely true. If everyone else is wearing a party hat, then you should too. Not so sure about that premise. Note that, this premise, this implicit premise, right, is the one that's false. That's the one that's problematic. Why this argument is what we might call fallacious, reasons that it's a fallacy, is because it sort of relies on this claim that if everyone else is doing something, then you should do it too. And that, though a common argument, is not a very good, a common premise, or a common reason given for doing something, is not a good reason for doing that thing. So that's what reconstructing arguments is for. It helps us figure out why someone thinks we should do a thing, or why someone thinks we should believe a certain thing. And when we reconstruct the argument, we can really dig down and sort of evaluate, is the argument they're giving me one that's convincing, or is it problematic in some way? The final thing I want to do is give you some tips about reconstructing arguments. So here are a few tips. First, each of our valid argument forms that we're using for this class has at least one conditional premise, an if-then premise. So if the argument that you're reconstructing has an implicit premise, and you don't already have a conditional premise in the argument, then you're going to need to add one. So your argument at some point is going to have an if-then premise. When you're doing this, when you're adding one in, take a look at the valid argument forms you have, make sure you're adding the right conditional premise. Another thing to note, and I say here the most important part of reconstructing arguments, is identifying the conclusions. So we might want some tips on how do I identify an argument's conclusion. First tip, and this is just very general, right? Look for the claim that the other claims are supporting. That's the conclusion. What is this person trying to get me to believe? That's another thing you can ask for help finding the conclusion. The goal is to look for indicator words, like consequently, entails that, hence, implies that, so, therefore, and thus. Any statement, right, proposition that follows these indicators is usually the conclusion. Another tip is to look at the beginning and at the end of an argument. So the argument's conclusion is usually going to be in one of those two places, either at the beginning of the argument or the end. The premises, most frequently the premises come first, the argument comes at the end, but sometimes someone might say, here's my conclusion, now here's why I'm arguing for that. If all else fails, it's possible the conclusion is implicit, like that argument we just looked at. Make sure to consider that possibility. Once you have a valid argument, are you done? Basically, but you really do ideally want to see whether there's anything else you can do to make the argument clear and or more plausible without altering the argument too dramatically. So you're trying to give your opponent's best argument. Note that changing one part of the argument is going to usually require you to make a corresponding change somewhere else in the argument, so you want to make sure you do that. Although it's important to do this with your arguments, it's especially to do this with other people's arguments. So otherwise we say you're being uncharitable, which is a vice that's opposed to intellectual empathy. When you just sort of give a bad version of your opponent's argument, we call that straw manning your opponent. You're sort of making their argument an easy target for you to maybe knock over. So ideally what you want to do is provide the sort of best or strongest version of your opponent's argument that you can. Alright, that's it for this video. Hopefully you found that helpful and it'll be useful as you're reconstructing arguments in the future.